In Sacramento, California recently, a middle-aged white male wearing a U.S. flag t-shirt that on the back reads, "Stand for the flag," had something awful planned for these Chinese immigrants working at this nearby Chinese American-owned meat store. This individual, according to authorities, walked out of his home, went for a drive, and somehow got a hold of a dead cat. Put the deceased animal in a box and dropped it in the parking lot where these Chinese immigrants work. But he's caught on surveillance camera moments before inside the store, and then outside standing behind his truck where he drops the box with the dead cat. A customer finding it and alerting Kelly Shum, who owns and runs the meat company with her Chinese American parents. Kelly calls police to report the incident as a hate crime.
It's a violation to feel that people hate you so much that they would be willing to hurt to get their message across, to get their point across, to get their hate across, to get all of that. And it's extremely disappointing. And for us, it's scary because, okay, so does that mean we're next? Immediately after the incident, I had 4 staff members quit because they didn't know if it was going to escalate. They didn't know if, this meant, okay, well, are we being targeted now because we work here? Are we going to be safe working here? The people who were most shaken up was our production team, who is mostly Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans.
More than 100 physical attacks on Asian Americans have been reported in 16 of the most populous cities in the United States in the first 4 months of 2021. Attacks on Asians in cities like New York and Los Angeles have increased by an unprecedented 164% since 2020. Attacks that human rights groups say began increasing in 2020 after the outbreak of the coronavirus. Attacks partly fueled, they say, by former President Donald Trump's inflammatory rhetoric about the virus's origins. The nonprofit Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate reports more than 4,000 other incidents of anti-Asian hate that include shunning and racial slurs, in addition to physical attacks. A majority of the attacks directed at women, and many against the elderly, particularly here in San Francisco's Chinatown, says George Chan, Executive Director of Chinese Newcomers Service Center, who says several newly arrived Asian immigrants in San Francisco have been beaten and robbed right outside these front doors of the center in the last year.
We have some people get attacked in this area.
Right in front of your building?
Right in front of my building.
2 victims, he says, were followed to this tunnel just a few steps away and assaulted.
This is the tunnel. A couple of the victims got robbed, got attacked.
He says the threat alone of violence here has driven away many volunteers who used to come here to welcome immigrants to the city.
But after the recent incidents, it looks like those volunteers are scared. Even we have a couple volunteers saying that they are no longer able to come here because they are afraid, yes.
While many victims in San Francisco have been the elderly, the city's younger Asian Americans here say the increase of hate crimes against their people has impacted their lives too. For example, an Asian Studies and International Studies major at the University of San Francisco named Evan Matthew Chan, a Chinese American student who's also minoring in Chinese studies, recently wrote a widely read essay in one of the city's newspapers here about the psychological trauma inflicted on the Asian American community these days. He says his fear of being attacked led him to quit his job supervising an ice cream parlor, where he says some of his customers seem to blame him as a Chinese American for the pandemic and for them having to wear a mask. He says most of his customers were white from San Francisco's affluent Pacific Heights neighborhood.
It was very scary, to be honest, because as a very young Chinese American, what am I going to say to an older affluent white family or white individual? And walking home, getting off from work at 9, 10, 11 p.m., it It is scary. Even though my job was less than a mile from home, I was walking through the neighborhoods I considered home, but nonetheless, I would have to pull my mask up. I would have to put on a hat just to make myself feel some form of security so that in the nighttime darkness, people wouldn't be able to see who I was.
How humiliating is that?
It really is humiliating, and it really just reminds me of the legacy of hurt that our community has faced throughout these past couple centuries.
For example, he says the slave labor Chinese immigrants endured in the 1800s working on U.S. railroads. And during California's gold rush,
My family had taken part in both of those industries at the time.
then Chinese immigrants later prohibited from coming to the U.S. altogether under the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
This isn't isolated to the pandemic. This, of course, is a legacy of the anti-Asian discrimination that this country has perpetuated since the 1800s, ever since the first immigrants stepped foot in this country.
And he notes the internment of Japanese Americans in the United States during World War II, when nearly 120,000 of them were forcefully relocated to live in these squalid camps on the west coast of the U.S. Decades of discrimination, he says, against Asian Americans.
These have left irrevocable effects on our communities, in the communities that we live, and the way that we operate in our communities.
Reaction from white citizens in the U.S. about attacks on Asian Americans is mixed, like from these two sisters visiting San Francisco from the Midwest. Sandy Scholes says everybody needs to calm down a bit. That news coverage of racial attacks against Asian Americans make it seem attacks are happening on every corner.
I guess I feel like it's a little overblown.
Her sister Donna says she's more sensitive about the subject.
My husband's Chinese. He's an American-born Chinese, doesn't speak Chinese.
Donna Wong says Asian Americans should by no means be blamed for starting the coronavirus pandemic.
It's just a virus that could have come from anywhere, but Trump called it the China flu, so then that just stirred up people to get that hatred out for Asians.
Others, like San Francisco street performer Keith here, say Asian Americans nor anyone else here should be attacked under any circumstances.
No, but what does bother me, no matter what race they are, is if somebody's been here for 80 years and they don't bother to learn the language or any kind of like assimilate into the culture that they're, like America's a great place because we have this melting pot. But when people just want to stick to their own culture, then it's like, then you get these bubbles.
Kelly Shum believes the intentions of the man who dropped the dead cat at her family's company were racially motivated, because she says he was wearing a Stand for the Flag t-shirt, a t-shirt and slogan that lately has become a favorite among right-wing extremists and white supremacists in this country, according to some anti-hate groups.
In this current political climate in 2021, in a post-Trump era, standing with the flag means you are kind of representing this group of people who subscribe to this idea of white supremacy in this country, that people of color don't matter to them because violence is what matters. Law and order by their standards is what is acceptable. And everyone else has to fall in line or else you'll be, punished. That's how it feels. That's honestly how it feels.
Kelly says after security footage of this individual was released publicly on local television news, she was bombarded by people supporting this individual and criticizing her on social media for turning him in.
And they said, how dare you go after a patriot? How dare you make comments when his political views and what he did are not related? And I'm like, how is it not related?
Punishment for hate crimes in the U.S. can range from 10 years to life in prison, depending on the level of violence involved, such as murder. The FBI defines a hate crime as a criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. Key evidence that a hate crime has been committed includes the alleged perpetrator using racial slurs during the crime, or admitting that the crime was motivated by racial bias or hatred. Witnesses say this individual did not use racial slurs or indicate verbally that he was motivated by racial bias, which is why several weeks after he carried out this act, Sacramento authorities had not yet decided to charge him with a hate crime. Authorities unclear if dropping a dead cat in a box on the premises warrants a hate crime charge.
Because I guess the way that they had explained it to me was that the scope is so narrow of what like a hate crime can be. Like there has to be physical violence against me.
This individual, says Kelly, contacted her by phone shortly after this image was broadcast by local TV news channels around Sacramento.
When he first called me after the incident, he called me because he had seen his face all over the news. He was very upset. He called me and he goes, "That wasn't my intention."
Wait a minute. It wasn't his intention to leave a dead cat in a box at your
Correct. That is what he said. He is like, "I was just being really thoughtless. Like I was having a really, really bad day." And that's what he had said. And I said to him, I said, "So why do other people have to clean up after you or be on the brunt end of your bad day? For you, it's a bad day. For me, it's disposing of a mutilated cat in my parking lot." We had actually reported multiple incidents prior to this of people calling us the China virus, threatening to attack us, all of these things. Right here at my door, my sister was almost attacked for enforcing the mask. And this was literally last year at the beginning of the pandemic.
Kelly says after this latest incident with the dead cat, the individual went as far as trying to apologize to her and her staff for his behavior.
When he apologized to me, I refused to accept it. And I told him, I was like, "You are a terrible racist person. You don't deserve my forgiveness. You don't deserve any of that." Because if people of color have to keep being the better person when we are being attacked and when things are said or done to us, forgiveness is not the instrument of change that we need here. And I don't know what it is, but it's not that. Because I'm just tired of rolling over and pretending like everything's okay, and I'm tired of rolling over and pretending like that it's more noble for me to be the better person in this. It's not noble for me to be the better person. It would be better if I called it out for what it is, and it's just racism.